Welcome to the Brave Writer Podcast. I am Melissa Wiley, and I'm here today with the Brave Writer Director of Publishing, Dawn Smith, who is one of my favorite people on the planet, one of the best editors I have ever worked with. She's my editor on, years worth of arrows, darts, and quills. And definitely, Dawn, you are one of my favorite people to talk about books with.
Aw, well, thank you, Lissa. You are one of my favorite people to talk about books and all kinds of other bookish things with.
Yeah, Dawn, what time did we, how long ago did we get on this call to record this episode? And we're just now, 35 minutes later hitting record. Always so much to say. And today I get to talk to you about one of the best possible topics of all time, which is book series, our favorite book series, and why series are so special and so great for kids.
Yeah, they are amazing for kids.
Thank you for the brilliant idea.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, all you have to do is say, let's talk about books, and then we can figure out how to just expand that to be just a most phenomenal topic. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, okay, we will dive in. In the course of this conversation, I know that you and I are going to be talking about some of our favorite book series that, for me, many of them are series I encountered because of writing darts, like the Heartwood Hotel books and the Very, Very Far North series. And oh my gosh, Skunk and Badger.
Yes, so
and
many
Wings
good
of
ones.
Fire, right? I mean, there's so many Vanderbeekers. Amari. Okay, so we're gonna. So if you are listening, you will hear us talking about some of our favorite books that we have ever read and have ever written about and worked on darts for. And but in the context of that is why series anyway? So Dawn, tell me, why do kids love book series so much? And why do we love series for kids?
Oh, wow. So there are so many reasons. And first of all, when I am selecting books, there are so many times where I'll read a book and I'll just think, Lissa's going to love this. Lissa is going to love writing a dart for this. And so it's like this double whammy of, I know that this writing that just is going to resonate with you is going to then come through in the dart that is going to resonate with our families. So it's like this beautiful trickle effect of, wonderful literature. And when they're a part of a series, it's just so neat to see families engage with series and kids engage with series. And there's numerous reasons why series are important for kids. And so, one of the things that we often talk about when we start working on darts for books that are in a series is how the kids are already familiar with the characters. So they start reading a book they get the first book in the series. And then when we're working on the second book for the series, or even sometimes the third book for a series, kids just, once they get hooked on that first book, and then they start to get to know the characters, they start to get to know the setting, and then they also get really familiar with the author and the way the author plots a storyline and the way that they develop the characters and the quirky little personality bits. I mean, one of the Very, Very Far North is the one
that said quirky, and immediately I think of the Very, Very Far North.
Those characters are just phenomenal. And we've heard from parents who have said that their kids just have one character in that cast that they really resonate with. And so one of the things that's so amazing about book series is that the parent can read the first one with their child or with their family. And the parent gets to know and gets to help the child kind of set the scene. Some kids have a really hard time kind of constructing those worlds in their brain while they're reading. I mean, they're going through the process of decoding. They're going through the process of reading and putting all that effort into reading. So it can be really hard to then, continue to develop all the bits and pieces that come together as they're reading. So when the first book in a series is a read aloud, then the parent is there to help with some of that decoding parts, the tough parts of reading, and also get to talk to the child about the setting and about the characters and about how the plot is unfolding. In the Dart especially, we have the questions that follow along with the book as the plot starts to unfold and the climax. And so the parent can kind of do some of that world building and character development building and plot building with the child. And then even if the parent doesn't want to continue reading the series. So Wings of Fire is the first one that comes to mind because I think I read the first 5 books. I mean, the Wings of Fire series is set up so there's like 5 books that cover, I think, the five dragons, and then there's
like the types of dragons,
right? And then there's and then like each type of dragon is a character kind of representing their type of dragon that all comes together. And then like there's 5 more books in the series, and there's 5 different dragons, and I have no idea. I think I don't know how many books are in that series. Like there's no way I could have personally, as an adult, kind of sustained myself through, 11, 12, 13, 15 books. But because we read the first books in the series together, we talked about the characters and the world and everything. Then when my kids started reading the rest of the series, I was already familiar with kind of what's going on and how the author was structuring things. So the kids started reading, and then they're narrating back to me what they're reading because I am familiar with it. So even if it isn't some long drawn out series like The Wings of Fire, but even if you read the first book and then the kids are taking over and they've got this world set up, they've got some of the things that they've got in place and the characters, and then they're coming back to you, or you're riding in the car, you're saying, well, what's going on in book 2? Like what's happening? And then they're telling you. And it's just such a beautiful thing to see, like so many pieces start to come together for them as they're narrating this back to you. They're really taking ownership of the characters and who they're really involved with and who they can like empathize with. And you'll find that they have characters that they kind of attach to, which can also be really surprising. Have your kids ever surprised you at like who their favorite character is?
Oh, for sure. It's not always, because you realize you're bringing so much of your own personal tastes and experience to it. And so you have characters that you're drawn to, and then they surprise you, and it helps you. Those conversations are so great because you start to get insight into your child when you understand like what connects them, what resonates for them with the character. Oh my gosh, you just like...
I like dumped on you.
No, that was amazing. You hit on so many important points.
I'm like, really? This is a broad question. I felt like I needed a topic funnel there.
Well, great. We're gonna funnel it down in many directions, because here's the thing. What you just described encompasses both this raft of skills that our kids are gathering through this process of engaging with the series. And you also really hit on the joy factor, the delight of returning to a world that you love and you have warm associations with. And you've got like the joy of familiarity, like people like to know stuff about stuff. It feels good.
And they become like kids, especially when they become experts in this world that they're associating with. And so even when if their friends are reading the same series and they can engage in these conversations, I mean, some of the complex conversations I've heard my kids have with their friends who are also reading a series has just blown my mind. And then they're giving me their analysis, and then they're saying, but so-and-so thinks this, and I don't think that's what's going to happen next. In book 5, I'm sure, that's not what's going to, so they have these really amazing high level conversations where they feel a lot of ownership
they're occupying the same world together. They have shared frame of reference. They get all the inside jokes and references. And if we look at like meme culture, like we can recognize that everybody of all ages really loves to be in on the joke or in on the inside knowledge. So I think that just provides so much satisfaction for a kid, and it infuses their experience of reading with those feelings of satisfaction and joy, which is what we want them to have. And then in the context of that, what's happening? Like you said, they're learning a lot about character development.
Right.
They're developing an understanding of setting and world building. They start to know the world inside and out. And we will often see that expertise and delight spilling over into their own creative pursuits. They may be writing fan fiction inspired by the series. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. They're maybe doing drawings or creating art. I know my kids, one of the big series for my kids was the Warriors Cat series.
The cat one.
And there was a period where they had a table in their room that was for months at a stretch just covered with little teeny tiny cats made out of Sculpey. And they had like elaborate warriors fantasy play happening. In fact, we had to have like all sorts of precautions so that the toddler wouldn't smash the warriors. And you hit on something that was very true, like the connection with the character that becomes so meaningful. One of my daughters, it happened to be warriors that she identified so closely with a particular character that there was a point when she was about, 10 years old. She was dealing with a difficult situation, and I was sort of offering her counsel about how to navigate it. And she said, "Don't worry, Mom. I know exactly what, Featherpaw or whatever the cat's name was. I know exactly what Featherpaw would do."
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. And they're in this idea, they're empathizing with these characters, and they're building up this background knowledge of a world. And then they're also like storing up these problem solving, these ways that other characters, other people would solve problems as a model. And they're anticipating based on the fact that they know the characters, like you said, like the inside jokes and the things that are happening. And that's the other thing about a series, is that even when you have a child that maybe struggles a little bit with reading, when you read the first book with them, you're providing them with this scaffolding and this framework where they're developing this background knowledge. They're developing the vocabulary of the world and the characters. And then when they go into reading more books in the series on their own, they are supported because they have all of this scaffolding in place for them to continue to move forward. And so many books and series they follow, for lack of a better word, a template. They often follow a pattern. And so the author is, while keeping kids in mind, because of course they know what who their target audience is. And so once these kids start to understand the patterns that books have by certain authors, then they can anticipate some of that, and it really boosts their confidence. I remember when my oldest was very into the Hardy Boys, and it was like, they were just devouring these books. Just going through them like crazy. We were at the thrift store just trying to find new ones, and it was a huge confidence boost. And then they started writing. They started more mysteries. Like, it really sparked the mystery genre for them. And these were easy books to read. The Hardy Boys is not written at, it's not literature in the sense of like highbrow literature, but I was just feeding the flame. And then, we continue on, and we finally get to, Sherlock, and, we're reading Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and then just expanding out on this whole mystery genre. Right. And I remember at one point, my oldest was like, "Mom, there's a formula."
Which is a fantastic insight. And
I think,
a lot of times the way that I see like teaching literary concepts to kids is exactly the opposite of how we approach it in the darts and the arrows. And it's the opposite of like the organic process that a kid goes through when they get really hooked on a series and they start to perceive those patterns. So you have concepts like setting or story structure, like rising action, climax, falling action. You can start with the concept and pull in examples, but I think, and I really think that the work we've done together for so many years, Dawn, bears it out. I think that it's so much more meaningful to kids when it comes from the other direction. Here's this great book. We're going to have a great time reading it together as a family. It's a series. You're going to keep reading and living and inhabiting that world on your own. You are going to you're learning a lot about setting. If you have to describe the setting of the Very, Very Far North books or the Heartwood Hotel series, you can do that. You know how to describe it. Nobody had to say setting first and pull in examples.
Right. And they're inhabiting
about the world that these books happen in. The same thing with characters. And you can talk about, like, you as a parent get to ask questions about, like, how would that character handle this situation? Or, gosh, like, do you think that character made any mistakes? And really starting to, you're having high level conversations about character development.
Yeah.
But it's happening organically, connected to something the child loves. It can happen with language concepts as well. Like skunk and badger comes to my mind.
Love it.
Okay, I'm just like insanely in love with those books. Definitely some of my favorites that I've read with my kids and my favorite darts to have written. And part of the joy of those books is the playful language, right? Yes. And so being able to notice like all the onomatopoeia and find out that there's a word that describes all these like words in the books that represent sounds that are spelled, and how do you represent that sound? How would you spell it? How do you spell meow? It's different in different languages. In fact, what even is the animal sound, right? Like cock-a-doodle-doo or kikiriki. So having the book as the context, noticing something happening in the book, and then, that's actually a thing that like writers like to do, and there's a name for it. It's happening not concept first, roping in examples. It's happening experience, encounter first. Right. And then here's a name for that. I think that just it creates for kids such an interest in language, that spirit of curiosity and playfulness that we think is so at the heart of real learning. Right. And so in the context of, that can happen with any book, right? But if we're talking about a series where they're revisiting, like you mentioned, the quirks that are really, unique to that series, whether it's the quirky characters of the Very, Very Far North or the quirky language of Skunk and Badger or the like warm and cozy setting of Heartwood Hotel.
Right. And I think what that really speaks to when they're exposed, especially when they're exposed to it in a series over and over again, is they really get tuned into voice.
Yes.
And that writers have a voice, because we often talk about in original writing, what we want to do is capture the voice of the child, that they have a unique voice in their original writing. And so pulling that in and helping them to have this experience of the writer's voice through character and plot and so many other aspects of storytelling. And then on top of that, adding things like book club parties, where like when you were talking about setting and being able to really like understand a setting, I'm thinking about the families that shared their book club parties for books like the Heartwood Hotel series and the Very, Very Far North series, where their whole table just covered in this snow-covered scene, and they've just created this amazing setting to reflect the book setting. And the kids are involved in that. I mean, we give ideas in the book club party guides at the end of every dart and arrow and boomerang, but the families that really kind of, I mean, so many neat parties have been shared where kids are bringing their ideas forward for the things that really hook them about the setting. And so what an amazing way for them to continue to develop their own keen sense of literature.
Yes.
And their keen ideas about the voice of a writer, almost through osmosis as you're having these natural conversations,
right.
Because that's one of the things that we always say is that, like, your kid may never see the dart, or they may never see the arrow, with the exception of the passage pages. If you as the parent want to just simply read through that and, kind of ingest what we're offering and then share that with your child in a natural conversation, it doesn't have to be around the kitchen table. And
right.
I think that piece of, like, here, we're going to give you the first book in the series, and then if your kid takes off and wants to read the rest, they're going to have the opportunity to then come back to you and use that foundational knowledge that they have from the first book to then call back and say, like, oh, the author did it again in this book, and look at, here's an example of this.
Right.
Speaking of that, one of the things that I used to have my kids do when they were taking off on a series is I would have them pick a passage. So say we read the first book together and they were reading book 2, 3, or 4. And I'd say, why don't you pick a passage and tell me what you found interesting about it? So putting them kind of in the driver's seat of pulling passages from other books in the series. Sometimes they would pick things that we talked about in the first book as, additional examples of how the author is continuing to use some sort of device or something that we discussed, or they might pick something totally different. But it's really, that is also a really interesting way to get them to engage with you, with the other books that you're not necessarily reading along with them.
Right. And, you're describing this really important first component, which is that you're sharing the first book in the series together, so that not only are they building this foundational knowledge about the world, but you have it also.
Yes.
And that's really important. Like, you're not having to try and pull from a kid's narration of a book that you haven't read and try and, like, keep all these characters straight. Oh, right. I want to get back to big cast of characters. That's something really important I want to talk about. You're not having to, like, keep all these different moving parts in your head because you have this shared foundation of knowledge. You also have the scaffolding.
Yeah, that is so incredibly helpful because, like, kids are great at narrating certain things, but trying to give you, like, the entire background knowledge of a whole world when you have no idea who these characters are and what the setting is and anything. So that's what I do love about reading the first book as a family together, because it provides you, the parent, with your own scaffolding to kind of hook on to the pieces that your child's narrating back to you from books that you aren't reading. So I love that. Yeah.
That makes you a better listener, which is going to make them a better narrator.
Exactly.
Their skills
and questions to ask. Like, well, do you think that, Roz the robot, like, did you think that she would really do that?
The wild robot.
I know. Now, there are some series that we do actually have all or quite a few of the books, like we keep talking about how we'll give you the first book to kind of launch you, but we have quite a few series, like The One and Only Ivan.
Yes.
Is the first book in the series with The One and Only Bob, and now The One and Only Ruby is out, and there's a One and Only Family book that's out. So we have the first 2 in that series. The Wild Robot, we have all of them. We have all 3 of the Wild Robot books. The Vanderbeekers, we have the first 2. So, we definitely are filling out some things for ones that are really popular. We'll go ahead and do additional books. But yeah, I was looking, and we have 14 at least first books in the series for the Dart level. And some of those we have multiple books, like Ra the Mighty, and the Ra books are just beyond delightful. So we did the second one. Yeah.
I have had the best time writing about Ra. I mean, those characters, talk about quirky characters, and just such like a strong first person voice who's kind of an unreliable narrator, but like You can see from how his friends interact with him, you get it.
Right. They know, like, Ra's kind of full of himself and
so fun.
not exactly the right person to talk to if you want to get the straight story.
I want to look at some of these series. Like, series often tend to have really big casts of characters.
Yes.
And it can be a lot to grapple with. And that's where I think this strategy of you reading the first book in the series to your kids or listening to it as an audiobook. I will say that I was not able to get through Redwall as a read aloud. It just, I don't know, it was too long for me.
It's a lot.
To stick with, and so many characters. But the audiobook's amazing. So either way, whether it's a read aloud or a listen along, and you guys are all doing a jigsaw puzzle while you listen to this book every day.
Yes.
Doing that first book of the series together helps kids in such an important way with handling a big cast of characters. I think about the Moomins. Okay, Dawn, you know that I'm just like, that's one of my all-time favorite book series. I'm so happy they're part of our program.
Yes.
Mama, like Moomin Mama is one of my life models. I sometimes ask myself, what would Moomin Mama do in this situation? And Snufkin, like that cast of characters is huge, and it shifts and grows with each book in the series.
And they come, are you going here? They come with the cast of characters.
They do. Like they have like drawings and a little line about, who these characters are. So that's a big help for the family to, keep a handle on it all.
Right.
Have you ever heard the expression, cells that fire together, wire together? This is a neurologist's description of what happens when your kids engage in purposeful practice. To that end, Brave Writer has a brand new product called Practice Pages. You know how sometimes you just want to target one sticky, tricky issue? Maybe your kids mix up common and proper nouns, or maybe they have a hard time differentiating between the three uses of there, and there. Now we've got these short lessons that make use of French-style dictation and reverse dictation tactics to narrow the focus to those specific tricky issues and help your child expand their practice so that those cells can fire and wire together. If you'd like to learn more, go to bravewriter.com/pages or check our show notes.
When a kid who's, as you said, doing the work of decoding just to read the book and having to master that process of imagining to picture the world and the events inside their minds, that's a big ask when we think about like what we're asking of a 7, 8, 9-year-old, especially, but older kids as well. It can be a big ask. If we do it as a family together, and if you're doing a read aloud and you can use voices for the characters. Now, I admit I'm a big ham, and that's one of my favorite things to do is character voices.
But for those of us who aren't good at that, the audiobooks are great.
Right. That helps people keep the characters straight.
Yeah.
And I'm mentioning the doing voices because, okay, my husband, Scott, he is an amazing reader aloud. He's so great. Like there are some series and some books that my kids, like, that's a daddy book. I mean, some of my kids are way up in their 20s, and there are still some books that, like, if dad's reading Watership Down or The Lord of the Rings to anyone in the family, they're in on it because, right, like gold standard for the
theatrical
voices.
Production.
But Scott will tell you that he didn't know, like growing up, that was a thing, that people read books out loud and did voices. He says that he learned it from hearing me read to the kids. And I was like, oh my gosh, like we met in a play. We're both giant hams. How would you not like take the opportunity to ham it up?
Love that.
So he like ran with it and does great voices. And both of us have these like stock character voices that we use in read alouds that become go-tos. So I'm not inventing like a whole new series of voices every time. There's always sort of the officious old lady voice for that character when she pops up. And I always have a Scottish one because I like to do a Scottish accent. That's fun.
Well, and it's interesting because we're talking about series. There have been times where like we'll listen to the first book and then the kids or I'll even, the kids will be reading the next books in the series, or I'll even pop in and read a little bit of something. And then those narrative voices are kind of in my head while I am then reading. So it can also be another way of scaffolding for kids to then, continue reading the series on their own and have that support there to kind of differentiate those voices along with whatever's on the page.
Exactly. And it helps with all the character names and place names as well. Especially in a fantasy series, it can be really difficult for young readers to navigate all these odd names that are unfamiliar to them.
Yes.
And so hearing somebody else say them, I mean, that's a big point of contention because my husband was the one to read Lord of the Rings to the family.
Oh.
All the characters get to be pronounced the way he heard them in his head, reading them as a kid. And I'm like, that's not how you say that.
We've had some like that too, where it's like, wait a second, what are they saying? That's not how you say it.
But that's really helpful. Another piece of scaffolding that we can give to our kids.
Well, when you brought up the Moomins, it kind of triggered something in me because we do not. We have the Finn family Moomin troll Dart. It's not the first book in the series, and so what that brought up to me was that there are really two kinds of series. There's sequential series where it's really, really helpful to read the books in order. Now, that being said, what I've noticed in these newer books, like the Amari series, where the first one's Amari and the Night Brothers, second one's Amari and the Great Game, the authors are doing an amazing job of kind of catching people up that jump in to the series, maybe not with the first book. And then you can go back and read the first book as if it were a prequel, because we all know ever since Star Wars released prequels are a thing, right? So there's sequential series where it's helpful to read them in order because one story builds on the next story. And usually, even though there's a self-contained narrative within that book, there's also an overarching story.
Right. And in fact, some of those books may end in cliffhangers.
Right.
Or not everything is all resolved. I think Wings of Fire comes to mind. Like
there's
the books do kind of exist on their own. But you sense that there's more to find out about an overarching story arc.
Right. So those are sequential. And then there's non-sequential series where you can just kind of dip in and it really doesn't matter. Like you might, because you've read the first few books, you'll have some more of that background knowledge of the character and things like that, but it's not really essential that you read them in order. So the Renee Watson stories with Ryan Hart, Ways to Grow Love and Ways to Make Sunshine is kind of like that, where you're just, the story itself is a complete narrative on its own. You don't have to read the first one before so you don't have to read, Ways to Grow Love before you read Ways to Make Sunshine or either order. So that's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind when it comes to series. And we will often, if there is a book in a series that we offer as a Dart or Arrow or something, we will often put a note like, this is the second book in the series, but you don't need to have read the first book. So, the Heartwood Hotel books are like that. The Very, Very Far North books are like that, where you don't have to read them in order. The Raw books, Raw the Mighty, Raw the Tomb, what's the second one? The Tomb Raider.
My observation is that has been the trend in middle grade publishing over the past, several years. I think because it allows publishers to put out books in an unpredictable time when they don't know if they're going to be able to continue publishing, the fifth, sixth, and seventh book in a series. Publishers love series, and they definitely look for books that will bring readers back to the world over and over again. But the more episodic kind of standalone inside the series books, I'm seeing more and more of those appear.
Yeah. And the first couple chapters are usually really skillfully done, where they fill readers in without totally spoiling the first book.
Yes.
But just to kind of get them up to speed in case they haven't read it.
Which is a great example for our kids.
Middle grade writers are phenomenal, honestly. Like, they're so skilled.
Are we? Thank you.
Yes, you are, Alyssa. Oh my gosh. I love it.
I think that is such great modeling for kids to find out that, like, there is a way to cover backstory and do a quick introduction to these people without having to recap the entire thing. That's yet one more like skill, just like pacing and setting, and all of these literary skills, writing concepts that they absorb from reading. I want to talk about, you mentioned the word formula. I love that story about your kid, like picking up after a lot of time in a series, like, oh, there's a formula here.
Yeah.
Formula fiction sometimes gets disparaged as if it's a bad thing that you can sort of predict the beats of the story. The reality is we all love it. There is a reason why genre fiction like romance, sci-fi, fantasy, the types of fiction that tend to be more formulaic, mystery. Yeah.
I mean, in an unpredictable world,
the best-selling types of books. Wait, I want to hear. What was that? Say that.
I was just going to say, in an unpredictable world, who doesn't like some predictability?
Yes. We look for it in television shows as well. Like, we have a lot of absorbed expectation about kind of the beats a story's going to hit. And sometimes the fun is seeing how that expectation is subverted. But there, as you said, I mean, like, why do people like cozy mysteries? Why is that one of the biggest genres in the world right now? Because there's going to be a pattern that is followed. That is so important for kids. And I have, over the years, like, many times, parents have expressed to me some concern, like, all my kid wants to do is read The Boxcar Children, or all my kid wants to do is read Wings of Fire over and over and over and over. And I'm like, fantastic.
That's amazing. Yeah.
That is great. Do not get in the way of that. When they're ready to read other things, they will. But in the meantime, look what's happening. Their literacy skills are expanding. They're reading faster because they know what's happening, and they decode the words faster.
Right. And that familiarity is such a confidence boost for them. Yes. And then when they go and they can push themselves a little harder on some other text, and then they can go back to that kind of like safe zone of like their favorite series and reread it again.
Right.
Because it's like, oh, this is the familiar, but they're still gaining so many skills by revisiting the familiar.
I completely do it myself as an adult with a really, wide and rich reading life. Right. Oh my gosh, there have been times in my life when what I want is to go back to Agatha Christie or Anne of Green Gables, or A Wrinkle in Time. Like, there's a reason why we crave a return to the familiar. It's important. And for kids, it helps. They're able to jump out of the book and start telling their own stories about it. And I mean, I have one of my kids has autism and intellectual disability. And the Boxcar Children series was hugely important for him in his like elementary school age years, because it was predictable, because he knew the characters. And he did a lot of creating his own stories about those kids because he had facility with it. He had expertise in it. So I think he became the reader that he is and the writer that he is because of the years upon years he lived in the world of the Boxcar Children.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so important to let them just simmer in all of that language and familiarity and comfort
Yes.
that can boost their feeling of accomplishment and their coziness with
Right.
books. I mean, like, who doesn't want their kid to be cozy with books? So that feeling that books can be a place of comfort and the safety of like knowing the predictable storyline is going to be there for them.
Right.
And so, I mean, I would highly encourage parents to praise and definitely encourage the rereading. And that is another when you're looking at your homeschool budget and what you're going to spend money on.
Right.
The series that your kids love, owning those books could just be huge because they can just read them at their own pleasure. They don't have to worry about returning them to the library. Those books can become friends, can become companions. I mean, my kids still at ages 18 and 21 own certain series that they loved when they were younger. And yeah.
Some of mine like bought books that we owned as a family because they wanted their own copy.
Their own copy.
When they moved out. And I think it's so important. Sometimes adults in kids' lives like can apply a little bit of shame to the, oh, those are too young for you. Haven't you outgrown those? Or like, don't you want something new? And I think it's just really important to instead let it be an experience of total delight and warmth and discovery, because there is always something new to discover. And I think a helpful way for adults to think about it is, do you have recipes that you make over and over? Or do you have to always make a new recipe every time?
I love that.
When a holiday meal comes around, are there dishes that your family expects and without them, it just doesn't feel right?
Right. Those are the comfort foods, those comfort foods that you go back to, those foods that make you feel cozy. And the stories can be the same way. Or, you know, on that light, because we're heading into the holidays, how many people watch the same holiday movies every year over and over again? Because they have a sense of, you know, you're in on the story, you know what's going to happen, but it's exciting and wonderful to share together. So,
and just because those mashed potatoes are not new doesn't mean they don't still nourish me.
Exactly. I love that. You know, speaking of that, one thing we didn't touch on that I think is something worth talking about as we wrap up here is that series can not like we've talked about this idea where kids get invested in characters or invested in settings. And I think there's something to be said for like when they empathize with a character. And you talked a little bit about your kids kind of like creating some fan fiction and like writing about characters or like making up their own stories, because those worlds are built. Like a lot of the really heavy lifting of writing is done. So those worlds are built, the characters are fleshed out, and then they can just kind of insert them in these different situations. But the other thing that happens, and I've seen it happen over and over again, is that when they relate to a character and they relate to something going on with the character or something the character's doing, they also are then inspired to try something new. So the character is into painting, and so they want to try to paint. The character is into soccer. So, you know, hey, I want to sign up for soccer. I want to learn to play soccer. So this idea that the reading that they're doing can actually spark real life interests that can then go on and become their hobbies or things that they pursue for, you know, who knows, maybe their whole life. But I think there's so much to really look at there in the way that the books are developing kind of what they're doing in their real life.
That is such a great point. I'm so glad you said that. Like think of Skunk and Badger and how Badger is a geologist. He collects rocks, and there's a lot of you're absorbing. I learned a lot in those books about different types of rocks and minerals. And so I know that many kids have jumped out of that book into a keen interest in rocks and minerals and geology themselves.
Yeah. And the next thing you know, you're at the library. They want to get the eyewitness book about rocks and minerals. They want to go to the to the Natural History Museum. Then all of a sudden it's just this spark, and that the character that they associated with, the character that they emphasize with, can then spark this whole pathway for them to just investigate something totally new and enrich their life in the most amazing way. So I love that part of series too.
Because for me as a kid, it was maps.
You kind of dig in. Oh,
all the books that had maps on the end papers. When I was a kid, I used to create fantasy worlds just so I could draw a map of it. And I would come up with names, and then that would suggest to me like, who lives there, and all these adventures, like all the playful writing that I did as a kid that I know led to me writing for kids as an adult. It grew out of
So Lissa, this is why every time we have a book that has a map in it, you're like,
we have to talk about the map, Dawn.
The Wings of Fire series have great maps and the things on the end papers. I remember how disappointed you were when the Skunk and Badger end papers on my book had all the little rocks and they were labeled and stuff, and yours didn't have it.
Yeah. The different edition.
Do you remember that?
I felt really cheated.
I got the Canadian edition. Mine was just all full of great end papers. I have no idea what happened there.
Budget cutting going on over here.
Yeah, but
in the States.
Really explore in the quill, because in the quill we're doing all kinds of stuff. So that's a really great aspect of the quill that we often explore, is the pieces of a book, like the book anatomy. And so there are, there's maps, there's little end papers, there's all kinds of stuff to explore, and we do that in the quill, which is really fun.
Oh, Dawn, thank you. I was so looking forward to this conversation, and it was even more fun than I knew. So here's what I want. I would love for our listeners to share with us their favorite book series that they've read with their kids, or that their kids are really into, whether you've read it or not. And if you had it, would you maybe we'd love to hear ways that your kids shared the world of that series with you. We will have a link in our show notes to a place where you can sign up to receive our podcast SMS texts. I guess that's redundant. SMS is texts. You guys know what I mean.
They're messages to your phone.
And then leave us a comment on Julie's Instagram, which is where we get all of our feedback on the podcast, or my Instagram. Everything will be in the show notes. Or let Dawn know what your favorite series are. We really want to know.
Yes, we would love to know that.
Dawn, thank you for being here with me today.
Oh, you are so welcome. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk bookish things with you.
Well, I know we have another bookish conversation coming up, because guess what? It's time for me to pick passages for the next dart I'm going to write.
I know. I'm very excited. I love our book conversations. All right.
I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Lissa.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Brave Writer Podcast. I'm Julie Bogart, and Melissa Wiley is my co-host. This podcast is produced by Nova Media with support from team member Jeanette Hall. Thank you for listening and for leaving either a starred or written review on the podcast app of your choice. Anytime you do that, you bring a lot of joy to the team and you support our work. So thanks in advance.